Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Pratt. I'm the Peacemonger. Today is Wednesday, the 11th of March. It's the afternoon here, but it's morning and early morning Chicago time. I'm delighted to welcome Professor John Mearsheimer. He doesn't really need any introduction, but he's almost, the godfather of realism in the modern era. John, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Ian.
Now, up until recently, I spent all my time talking about Russia and Ukraine, and I seem to spend most of my time talking about the situation in Iran. What is clear in this war is that one side has a strategy and the other does not. How do you assess the relative balance of advantage in the ongoing war?
Well, I think if you look at raw military power, there's absolutely no question that the tag team, and when I talk about the tag team, I'm talking about the Israelis and the Americans, that they have significantly more military power than Iran does. The United States, after all, is a superpower, and Iran is not even close to being a great power. But looking at the raw balance of power in this case, as in many other cases, doesn't tell you very much. When I was young, the American military fought in Vietnam. We were obviously much more powerful than the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong put together. And we won every battle, but we lost the war. And as you well know, after 20 years in Afghanistan, the Taliban beat us. So just looking at the raw balance doesn't tell you much. And I think, excuse me, I think that what you have to do is you have to look at the strategies that the two sides are employing, and you have to look at the goals that they're seeking to achieve and ask yourself the question whether or not each side can achieve its goals. And it's best to start with the Israelis and the Americans. They set out to achieve regime change. And regime change is essential because if you want to achieve those other particular goals that the Israelis and the Americans have in mind, such as eliminating the ballistic missile force, eliminating completely Iran's nuclear enrichment capability, and eliminating Iranian support of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, you have to have regime change, and you have to put in place a new regime that will be effectively subservient to the Americans and the Israelis. Otherwise, you can't achieve those particular goals that I just described. So regime change is absolutely essential. And the Israelis and the Americans have recognized that from the beginning. Therefore, the question is, how close are we to achieving regime change? We had this decapitation strategy at the start of the war that was designed to produce regime change. It failed. And now we're employing a punishment strategy where we inflict massive punishment on the Iranian population. And the hope is that this will lead to an uprising and we'll get regime change. But it's having the exact opposite effect. It's causing a rally around the flag effect in Iran. So all of this is to say that the Americans have not achieved their goals, and no one can tell a plausible story about how we do that in the foreseeable future. There's no strategy there for producing regime change. And again, if you don't produce regime change, all those other particular goals are not going to be achieved. Now, if you switch over to the Iranian side, their goal is simply to survive, to continue lobbing missiles and shooting drones at the other side, and inflict significant pain on the United States and on the Israelis through a variety of means. And the Iranians are alive and firing missiles and drones, and there's no evidence that they're going to stop doing that. So if you look at where the war is at this point in time, it looks like the United States is in effect losing and doesn't have a magic formula for winning.
Yeah, I completely agree. And when I was in Afghanistan, the Pashtuns had this saying, you've got the watches, but we've got the time. You're right, Iran. The tariff on their victory is just survival, but the tariff on U.S. and Israeli victory is much more immediate and short term. They have to be able to declare victory through eradication of ballistic missile capabilities, nuclear kind of programs, and deliver regime change. And time is just not on their side with the global economy falling apart. How much time do you think the Americans have before they kind of throw the towel in on this?
It's hard to say. And I think that a lot depends on what happens with the international economy. And a lot of what happens there depends on what happens as the two sides ratchet up the escalation ladder. There's no question that the United States is going up the escalation ladder along with the Israelis. And if we target their oil infrastructure, for example, and they retaliate by going after oil infrastructure in the Gulf. And you want to remember that oil infrastructure in those Gulf states provides a target-rich environment, so the Iranians can do enormous damage to that petroleum infrastructure. And if they do that, that will really have devastating consequences on the international economy. But if they don't do that, then the war can go on for quite a while because the damage to the international economy will not be that great. I noticed where the media is beginning to report that the Americans are very unhappy with the Israelis for targeting the oil infrastructure in Iran, because I think the Americans understand that the Iranians will retaliate. They have the capability to do enormous damage to the oil infrastructure in these Gulf states, and we don't want that. But who knows, what happens moving forward as you go up the escalation ladder. There are just a lot of unknowns there, a lot of uncertainty. But my sense is, Ian, that the only thing that can end this war quickly is the perception that the international economy is going to go off a cliff, and this just has to be stopped. But if that's not the case, if the West, or here we're talking about the United States and the Israelis, but if the United States and the Israelis decide that they can avoid going off a cliff and that they can continue to exact punishment on the Iranians, the war could go on for quite a while.
Yeah, even Lindsey Graham tweeted something almost reproaching the Israelis for targeting Iranian oil infrastructure. He said nothing about the school children that were killed, in a school, sadly. How many realizable steps up the escalation ladder do you think the Americans and the Israelis realistically have at their disposal?
Well, the problem that we face is that Iran is a huge country. It's the size of Western Europe in geographical terms, and the Iranians have about 93 million people. Uh, so to destroy Iran, to inflict punishment on Iran along the lines of what the Israelis have done in Gaza is just not in the cards. You just can't do that. There's no question that we can inflict a lot of punishment on the Iranian population, and that's the strategy that we're now pursuing. But the historical record is clear here that you can inflict massive amounts of punishment on a civilian population, and they don't quit. It's really quite remarkable. But the historical record is clear here. So there's no question that we can inflict significantly more punishment on Iran than we have already inflicted on them. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you think that this is going to lead to a popular uprising, or it's going to cause the regime to say enough is enough and we surrender. There's nothing in the historical record. I want to emphasize the word nothing. There's nothing in the historical record to make us think that this is going to happen. And if you look at the Iranians and you think about how they performed in the 8-year war in the 1980s against Iraq, where they suffered somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 deaths, you quickly realize that the Iranians are tough characters. They're able to absorb huge amounts of punishment. So we can dish it out, but the Iranians, I believe, are not going to throw their hands up and quit. And furthermore, they have the capability to retaliate, as we were talking about before. They can retaliate against the petroleum facilities in the Gulf states, and that will have devastating economic consequences. And very importantly, they can retaliate against the desalination plants in the Middle East. The Middle East is basically one giant desert, and people depend heavily, especially in the Gulf states, on desalination plants to provide water. And those desalination plants are few in number and they're very vulnerable. They're big fat targets. And the Iranians have short range missiles that are very accurate that can hit them. And they have drones and they have lots of both. So they can take out those desalination plants. And if people don't have water to drink, they're going to die quickly. So when you look at the target environment and you take into account the desalination plants and you take into account the oil infrastructure in the Gulf states, you see where the Iranians can they basically have an assured destruction capability. They can wreck these countries. And that, again, has huge consequences. We don't know exactly what those consequences are, but almost everybody agrees that that would have hugely negative consequences for the international economy. And we would not end up destroying Iran. Iran would still be intact. It's not disappearing from the map. That's another question you have to ask yourself. Okay, even if we, get regime change of one sort or another, is Iran going to go away? Is that new regime going to dance to America's tune? I would not bet a lot of money on that. I think the chances of that happening are close to zero. And then when you throw in the incentives that the Iranians now have to acquire nuclear weapons, I think the vast majority of strategic analysts understand that the Iranians were idiots for not acquiring nuclear weapons. They should have gone down the North Korean road. So when this war is finally over with, there's going to be a very good chance that the Iranians go out and get nuclear weapons, which is going to leave us worse off than we were before February 28th. So all of these points add up to the fact that we have a strategy in Iran that is not only going to fail, but is going to leave us worse off than we were before the war started.
Yeah, I can't help but agree, and I also think that the US side is showing increasing signs of desperation to get the job done as quickly as they can. That they've already, I understand, in news today, tried unsuccessfully to assassinate the new head of state of Iran. Hegseth is talking about rubbish rules of engagement and how the US could have done a better job in Afghanistan and Iraq if their hands weren't tied. Has the US Is the US now abandoning all of its attachment to international law?
Just before I answer that question, let me just make a few comments about this whole argument that, we didn't do enough in Afghanistan, and if we really turn the dogs loose here, we can win a victory. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975. That's coterminous with the Vietnam War. We landed the first combat troops in Vietnam on March 8th, 1965, and I went into the American military as a private in the Army in June of 1965. The war ended, of course, in April of 75, and I got out of the Air Force at that point in August of 75. So I remember those days very well. I was a student at West Point for 4 of those years. And we talked constantly about how we could win the war in Vietnam. As you can imagine, the American military was deeply committed to coming up with a clever strategy that would allow us to win the war, not just win the battles, which, as I said before, we always won, but we weren't winning the war. What could we do? Could we try this strategy or that strategy? And after a while, you came to realize that there was no way we could win the war. You just couldn't do it. And there are now some revisionist books and articles that say if we had just done this or we had just done that, we could have won that war. This is the Vietnam War. And of course, the same argument is made with regard to Afghanistan. Okay, we stayed there for 20 years and we couldn't figure out a way to win it, but there was a magic formula. We just didn't stay long enough, or we didn't listen to the right person. These arguments are poppycock. There's no way the United States could win the Vietnam War in any meaningful way. Yes, we could have stayed there forever and still be there today, and the North Vietnamese would not have won. But is that a viable strategy? Of course not. And the same thing is true with Afghanistan. What were we going to do? Stay there for another 20 years? To keep a cap on things? This is crazy. And if you think about the war in Iran today, what's very interesting is that you can get people like us together, and we're very smart and very clever, but we can't come up with arguments against ourselves that one might use to show why we're wrong. I talk to all sorts of people about my arguments that I've just laid out to you, and I say, where am I wrong? What's wrong with my analysis? Where's the clever strategy here? And nobody has a good answer. And I think this is what's happening to the Trump administration, right? They're beginning to realize that those flip answers that people gave before the war started and then shortly after the war began no longer carry much weight. This is getting serious. Before the war and early in the war, they could talk about decapitating the regime and winning this stunning victory. They could buy all these arguments that Benjamin Netanyahu was making about how vulnerable the regime was and how we were going to win a great victory if we just showed some toughness and so forth and so on. But Netanyahu's arguments didn't pan out, and now they're beginning to ask the hard questions. That's what's happening. And when you start asking the hard questions, there are no good answers. There just aren't. Again, you and I can't come up with counter arguments to the ones that I've just laid out. And we're smart guys, and we can't do that. And that tells you that there are no good answers. And this takes me back to Vietnam and back to Afghanistan. There were no clever strategies available that we just didn't recognize or that we refused to employ. They just weren't there. There were no options for winning those wars. And it's hard to see how you win this war in any meaningful way. It just seems you can knock down every argument that one can make. But I just wanted to, emphasize that point very clearly. Now, let me go to your main question, which is about international law. I think it's quite clear that President Trump does not believe in international institutions. He does not believe in obeying the rules that go along with those international institutions, because institutions are basically a series of rules that are designed to facilitate political and economic intercourse among the countries who belong to those institutions. And furthermore, he doesn't believe in international law. And I would take it a step further and talk about domestic institutions and domestic law here in the United States. He doesn't have any respect for American institutions. He has no respect for Congress, no respect for the courts, no respect for the rule of law. He does pretty much what he wants. He's a unilateralist par excellence. And international law, by definition, is multilateral in nature. And he's not interested in obeying the law if it gets in the way of what he thinks is best for the United States or what he thinks is best for Donald Trump. And again, this is true at the national level here in the United States as well. He just does what he wants. So what's happened here is that President Trump has done enormous damage to international institutions, and he's done enormous damage to international law. And what's truly amazing is that the Europeans have helped him along the way. It's really quite remarkable that the Europeans, who have long been deeply committed to international law and international institutions, have abandoned that position, and they go along with Trump. They appease Trump. They lick Trump's boots. The Europeans should have been condemning this illegal attack on Iran on February 28th. They should have been condemning the assassination of the Ayatollah. And they should be condemning just the way the United States conducts foreign policy in general. Uh, but that's not been the case, except for Spain. The Spanish stand out as the exception. It's just truly amazing, sort of where we are. And Trump has not quite 3 more years left in office. You really wonder what's going to be left by the time he leaves office, uh, almost 3 years from now.
Yeah, I'm personally not convinced he's going to make it that far, although he'll obviously kind of cling on to power. Let's see. In terms of difficult questions, so this is the latest one that people are kind of stumbling and mumbling around in Western mainstream media. Is the US willing to put boots on the ground? And more than that, is it actually ready?
Well, boots on the ground, if we're talking about a large scale invasion of Iran, similar to what we did in Iraq, I think that is unthinkable. I think Trump could not get away with that. And I don't think he would do that to begin with. Uh, and you want to remember that the temptation is there because almost everybody recognizes that you can't get regime change uh, simply through bombing a country. You have to put boots on the ground if you want regime change. The record's quite clear on that. You can get regime change in Iran, but it requires boots on the ground, which is, of course, what prompts your question, because they haven't gotten regime change with air power alone. So now maybe time to send in the ground troops. That's not going to happen. They are talking about two possible contingencies where we send in ground troops. One has to do with the nuclear material that is in the possession of the Iranians that is enriched up to 60%. As you know, you only have to enrich uranium to 90% to get weapons grade material. And the Iranians have a large amount of Iranian enriched in uranium that is enriched up to 60%. And we're very worried about that. And there's talk about maybe sending special forces teams into Iran to capture that 60% enriched uranium. So that's one scenario people are talking about. And the other is talking about using the 82nd Airborne, which has apparently been mobilized to maybe conquer or capture this small island, Harg Island, that belongs to Iran and is located in the Persian Gulf and has a lot of Iran's oil infrastructure located there. So we're talking about possibly doing that as well. To be honest, I would be surprised if we did either one of those operations, but they're small scale in nature and they're not going to produce success in any meaningful way. And I think the Iranians are smart enough to have figured out that those are possibilities and they've built a defensive capability to deal with them. So I don't think we have a ground forces option here. And I think that President Trump would be, to put it bluntly, I think he'd be nuts to send ground forces into Iran. And what that tells you then, Ian, is that he's going to have to rely on air power, which is what we've been doing up to now. And if you look at the historical record on what air power can do for you, there's no real cause for optimism here.
Yeah, well, your good colleague and actually one-time student back in 1982, Robert Pape, has written very eloquently on that subject with his book "Bombing to Win." Won't this whole mess just simply mobilize Arabs and Iranians against US military hegemony and actually Israeli hegemony in the Middle East?
There's no question about that. It'll certainly mobilize the Shia in places like Iraq. And Iran, of course, is basically a Shia country. In Bahrain, where the population is 70 plus percent Shia, and in all sorts of other places. I think even more generally, it's enraged people in the Arab and Islamic world. And you want to remember, Ian, we're not just talking about Iran, we're talking about the genocide in Gaza. I mean, one thing that's happened as a result of the Iran war is that we pay hardly any attention to the Ukraine war. It's really quite remarkable. Every day I say to myself, what's going on in the Ukraine war? And it's very difficult to find any information in the mainstream media and even in a lot of the alternative media about what's going on in Ukraine. And with regard to the Gaza genocide, hardly any attention is paid these days to what's going on in Gaza or what's going on in the West Bank. But people in the Arab and Islamic world have not forgotten the Gaza genocide. So it's not just Iran, it's the Gaza genocide as well. And then I would add to that, if you are a person who lives in one of the Gulf states, you have to ask yourself the question, how do you think about dealing with the West, uh, and especially the United States? Because it's the United States that is responsible for the fact that you're being bombed and your country may be ruined. If you live in the UAE or you live in Bahrain or you live in Saudi Arabia, and you think about where you are today compared to where you were before February 28th, the situation is obviously much worse today. And there is a possibility your country will be destroyed. I mean, literally destroyed. And you then have to say to yourself, who's responsible for this? And in a way, you can blame Iran, but if you think long and hard about it, the Iranians are not responsible for this fiasco. It's the Americans and the Israelis. And the Americans and the Israelis, one could argue, are the real threat to you. So I think when this war is finally over with, it's going to be very interesting to see what the Gulf states do in terms of their relationship with the United States. There's no question that they're going to still fear Iran for all the obvious reasons. And that's going to push them towards the United States. But there are countervailing forces at play here. And that is that if you get too close to the United States, you see what happens. We're seeing it right now. And again, it could get much worse. So I think you're going to see countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, move closer to China and Russia and do everything they can to distance themselves from the United States. And indeed, before this war started, before February 28th, the Saudis had reached a strategic agreement with Pakistan, where Pakistan had promised to put its nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia. And then you saw that the Turks wanted in on that deal, that alliance. The Turks want to create a Pakistani, Turkish, Saudi alliance. Because the Turks understand that you really can't rely on the Americans. The Turks don't have nuclear weapons either. And the Turks also understand that if Iran is finished off, they're the next target. Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, has made some comments recently about Turkey that make it clear that once Israel's done with Iran, the Israelis will put their crosshairs on Turkey, which is exactly what you would expect from that ruthless regime. So I think that when all is said and done, this war is going to will have done really huge damage to America's position in the Arab and Islamic world. And not only in the Arab and Islamic world, by the way, also in countries like India as well. We could go on about that. This war is a catastrophe for the United States. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I always say that foreign policy begins and ends with from domestic considerations and domestic sort of limitations. Now, this war is already almost as unpopular as the US war in Iraq was 10 years after that war finished. You know, can Trump break all historical precedent and get the American people on board with this endeavor, do you think?
No, I think if anything, what happens is that the that public opinion in the United States goes south from this point forward. I mean, I think he's at a high watermark now. I think more and more people are beginning to realize this was a foolish enterprise. You want to remember that he took us into this war. He took the United States into this war when roughly 20% of the people supported going to war. Roughly 20%. Now, once he got into the war, there was a rally around the lag effect, which is what always happens. And then you get around 40% of the people who will support the war. So you went from 20% supporting war beforehand to around 40% supporting the fight once you're in it. That sort of thing always happens. But that will now begin to fall off, and people will begin to ask themselves, what's going on here? Why are we doing this? Uh, I think it was either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times had an article before the war, excuse me, slightly after the war started, that said this is the first time a U.S. president has taken the United States into a war where public opinion was decidedly against the conflict before it started. You remember the Iraq War in 2003. The propagandizing by the Bush administration was so successful that most Americans thought it was a good idea and they were enthusiastic about the war. But as you point out, public opinion went south over time. And today, that decision is widely considered to be the most disastrous decision in American foreign policy. Foreign Affairs, the magazine Foreign Affairs, did a poll of American diplomatic historians recently and asked the question, well, what was the biggest folly that any American president has made with regard to U.S. foreign policy? And number one on that list was the decision to invade Iraq in 2003.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with that. I think it's between 71 and 75% US public support for the war in Iraq in 2003 and 90% in 1991 for the Gulf War.
Yeah.
Um, so a question that often sort of plays on my mind is there, I mean, to me, as I see it, the White House seems to be packed with yes people, yet mostly yes men, but some yes women, as well. Is there anyone in the White House who can tell Emperor Trump that he has no clothes?
It's hard to say. I would think the one person who could do that is J.D. Vance. I think Vance has had reservations about this operation from the beginning. I think there's no doubt that Vance is very smart and he's capable of figuring out where we are and thinking hard about what to do moving forward. How much influence he has is another matter. He's in a very delicate position because he wants to be president someday, and he understands that to achieve that goal, he has to have President Trump's support. So he's not in a position where he can challenge Trump in any meaningful way. But I think once you get beyond Vance and you sort of look at who the other key players are in the decision-making process, people like Marco Rubio, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and especially Pete Hegseth, it's hard to have much confidence in those people. They either don't know much about foreign policy. I mean, if you think about Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner being Trump's principal negotiators on Iran, the Palestinian issue, and the Russia-Ukraine war, you really just say, how can this be? I mean, these two know hardly anything about foreign policy, and they have no diplomatic experience. And you're giving them three big portfolios to handle. Again, they're handling the Palestine issue, they're handling the Iran issue, and they're handling the Ukraine-Russia issue. These are amateurs. And with regard to Iran and with regard to the Palestine issue, and here we're talking mainly about the genocide in Gaza, these are two, ultra Zionists. I mean, these are two people who are profoundly committed to Israel. They should not be handling negotiations involving Israel. And that, of course, means the Iran and the Palestine portfolios. But they're handling those portfolios, and they're handling the Russia-Ukraine portfolio again. And they just don't know very much. These are inexperienced people. These are neophytes, and they have President Trump's ears. They're people who give him advice on what to do. So it's hardly surprising that we're in so much trouble. And then you look at people like Marco Rubio. I mean, Marco Rubio is not an impressive strategist, in my opinion. And he serves as both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Uh, so I don't know who's there giving Trump smart advice, but I hope that Vance is, and maybe a handful of other people who we don't know about.
Yeah. Do you think the Israeli stranglehold? I mean, you're the kind of the expert on this topic more than anyone, really. Will the Israeli stranglehold over the U.S. foreign policy establishment survive this catastrophic war in Iran?
It'll survive it, but it'll be weakened for sure. There's no question about it. And how much it's weakened remains to be seen. Uh, it's really quite amazing how many people understand that the Israelis have basically led us into this war, that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been the key force pushing President Trump to go to war against Iran. And all sorts of people understand now the power of the lobby. This is the Israel lobby or the Zionist lobby inside the United States. And because the war is not going well, this is bad news for Israel and bad news for the lobby in terms of how much influence it has inside of the United States. We're in a fundamentally different world today when it comes to the Israel lobby than we were back in 2006, roughly 20 years ago, when Steve Walt and I wrote the original article on the Israel lobby that appeared in the London Review of Books. Uh, Many, many more people understand that the lobby is out there influencing U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And those people also understand that it's not in the American national interest. But still, the lobby is enormously powerful, especially in Congress and especially on President Trump. So it remains to be seen moving forward just how much diminishment or how much the lobby is diminished and Israel is diminished in terms of its influence. I would make one final point on this, Ian, and that is that I think a lot depends on how this war plays out. If you read the media carefully these days, it's quite clear that the Americans are beginning to get cold feet in Iran, and they want to limit the amount of damage that we inflict on Iran. As I think I said before, the Americans are not interested in going after the oil infrastructure in Iran, and the Israelis are. And it's quite clear that the Americans are now looking for an off ramp, and the Israelis are not looking for an off ramp. So it is possible that you could have a big fight in public between the Israelis on one side with the lobby, of course, and the Americans on the other side. And here we're talking about the Trump administration. If Trump and company get desperate and they want to bring this war to an end, short of victory or anything that could be described as victory, and the Israelis are opposed to that, you could have an open fight. And that would further damage the lobby and it would further damage Israel's position in the United States. But whether that happens remains to be seen because we really don't know how this war is going to play out and then what the aftermath is going to look like.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I saw a report from Ginza. I think that they were making the case for boots on the ground. I think that's what it said. It sort of popped up on my screen just a day or so ago. But anyway, so I mean, in tiny faltering steps, the Europeans are kind of distancing themselves, from the US over this in an entirely predictable way. Russia is going to benefit in terms of the elevated oil price. I mean, that's absolutely clear and completely predictable. What does all this mean for the Ukraine war?
Well, I think it's bad news for the Ukrainians. Almost everybody agrees on that point. Uh, as you say, excuse me again, uh, as you said, there's no question that the Russian economy is going to benefit in a big way from what's happening in the oil markets. You see this with India, right? The Americans put great pressure on the Indians to cut back on the amount of oil they imported from Russia. We've now done a 180-degree turn on that, and we're telling the Indians that it's fine if they buy Russian oil. This is good news for the Russian economy. Our efforts to strangle the Russian economy are clearly failing. So that'll make it easy for the Russians to continue waging this war from an economic perspective. But I would also think it's hard to get details on this, but I would also think that all of the ammunition and weaponry that we're expending in the Gulf War, and here I'm talking about the Iran war, is going to cause problems in terms of us providing weaponry for Ukraine. As you know, the United States no longer directly provides weaponry for Ukraine. The Europeans buy that weaponry from the United States, and then they send it on to Ukraine. I would imagine that there are limits now that were not there before February 28th in terms of what we can put in the pipeline to Ukraine. Exactly what those limits are is hard to say. But I would note to you that the United States is now pulling THAAD and Patriot missiles out of East Asia and sending them to the Middle East. This is causing huge problems in South Korea. The South Koreans don't want those THAAD missiles taken out, but we're taking them out because we have no choice. This is one of the consequences of getting into a protracted war in the Middle East. And by the way, you want to remember, Ian, that before the war started, General Kane, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told President Trump that we did not have the stocks of ammunition and weaponry to fight and win a long war in the Middle East. So what's happening here as we fall into a long war is that we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're taking forces out of East Asia and sending them to the Middle East. And this same basic logic is surely going to apply to Ukraine. So Ukraine's going to get less weaponry after this war started than it would have gotten had the war not started. So I think Ukraine is in bad shape as a result of this war. It was already in bad shape, as you know, but it's going to be in worse shape. And the Russians are in better shape because their economy will benefit from the war. So in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, this is a net positive for the Russians and a net negative for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And actually, you don't need to get into this, but the Europeans have already said, well, this is no time to buy cheap Russian energy, more self-defeating policy, but that's an aside. The final question, I know we don't know how much longer this war will go on, hopefully not too much longer. But staying down the barrel at November and midterms, do you think the Republicans are going to take a shellacking?
Well, it was quite clear before February 28th, when the war started, that the Republicans were in serious trouble. And most people thought that the Republicans would lose the House for sure and might even lose the Senate. The economy was not going in Trump's way for sure. And many people expected that things would get worse before the election in November, and that the affordability issue would really cause significant problems for President Trump and for the Republican Party more generally. When you throw the war in on top of that, and when you look at what's happening to gas prices, and you look at what's happening on the inflation front and so forth and so on, and then when you realize that this war is not over and the negative effects are not over and the negative effects may get much worse, you can see where the Republicans stand a really good chance of getting shellacked in the November election, to use your rhetoric. But as you know, November is a long time off, and politics is a crazy business, and anything can happen. But it's also when you talk about anything can happen, it's also possible that things could get much, much worse for President Trump. And if you had to bet whether you think things are going to get much worse for President Trump or they're going to get much better, I think you'd almost axiomatically bet that they're likely to get much worse rather than much better. So in terms of the November elections, I think the Republicans and President Trump are playing with fire. And you want to remember that if the Democrats get large majorities in the House and in the Senate, it's likely that they will move to impeach President Trump. He's been impeached twice now, and it's hard to imagine that the Republicans wouldn't face a third effort at impeachment by the Democrats. And that's the nightmare scenario for President Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with that. And like you, I think that when you look at the different factors on balance, things are more likely to get worse than they are to get better. But anyway, Professor John Mearsheimer, thank you so much for taking the time to join today. I know how into mind you are as the sort of the godfather of realism in the modern era. Thank you everybody for watching. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you very much peace. And John, thank you again so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ian, very much for having me on the show. I enjoyed our conversation very much, despite the fact that the subject matter is categorically depressing.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's hope for less depressing things ahead. Thank you so much for watching my Peacemonger videos. If you'd like to support my work promoting peace around the world, then please consider clicking the subscribe button and liking any videos that you see, leaving any comments or questions in the chat. You can also support my work by buying a copy of my memoir, A Misfit in Moscow, How British Diplomacy Failed, about my 4.5 years serving at the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2019. You can find that on Amazon or any major book retailer websites. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate every like, every comment that you provide. And don't forget to click the subscribe button. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your religion, whatever your nationality, I wish you very much peace. My name is Ian Proud and I'm the Peacemonger. Thank you so much.